In just a few minutes, we will hear from FBI Director Christopher Wray about the attack on the Capitol for the very first time. Taking a live look at Capitol Hill now, where the Senate Judiciary Committee will ask Wray about what the FBI knew and when they knew it, and the threat of domestic extremism. So senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge has been following this case from the very beginning, and she's here now to tell us what we can expect from today's hearing. So, Catherine, we heard last week from the former chief of the Capitol Police, as well as the sergeants at arms, and the big takeaway from the hearing was there was clearly a breakdown in communication, that the FBI had knowledge of a threat, that knowledge was presented, and somehow it never made it all the way through all the various law enforcement agencies that needed to know about it and needed to spring into action. I imagine that that will be at least part of the focus of today's hearing.
Well, Anne-Marie, that will definitely be a central focus of today's hearing. Just to kind of set the table for folks at home, what we've heard consistently through our reporting here at CBS News is that the intelligence suggested a very large crowd and a significant potential for violence, but violence between groups on the left and on the right, not specifically violence directed at the Capitol. And these requests for the National Guard had to come from the Capitol Police and then also the D.C. mayor, who prior to the riots requested about 340 National Guard, but that request was to support crowd control and traffic control, not necessary a force that could really deal with the potential for a large-scale riot.
So, Catherine, what exactly was in the FBI memo that didn't make it up to law enforcement?
Well, Vlad, there's something called a situational information report, or an SIR, and you can think of it kind of like data miner. It's a flash report. They don't necessarily have a lot of legwork done on its reliability or credibility. And that's what came out of the FBI Norfolk office on the evening of January 5th. It was from a single thread on a social media or internet platform that said supporters of President Trump were heading to the Congress and they were prepared for war. That was sent out to what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or JTTF. And that was then pushed out to the Capitol Hill Police. And that's where it stopped, essentially, in their intelligence unit, and never reached the leadership within the Capitol Police or the sergeant at arms, who are responsible for the physical security on the House side as well as the Senate side of the campus.
So can you talk to us about just how intelligence sharing works between law enforcement agencies? And what I kind of got from the previous hearing, too, was, Capitol Police are in this sort of a unique situation in that it seems like they don't have the same sort of leeway or freedom of movement or freedom to request certain things that perhaps other law enforcement entities do.
So I'll take that sort of in two parts. So the first part on intelligence sharing, there's something called the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I just mentioned it in the last answer. But to sort of explain it further, these are set up like fusion centers all across the United States. And just imagine a large room that has representatives from local, state, and federal agencies. So they're all talking together. So when a piece of important intelligence comes in, it's taken to the JTTF and then shared amongst all of those parties. That's what happened with this Norfolk intelligence bulletin. But the problem, according to the former Capitol Hill police chief, is that it got to his intelligence unit on the night of January 5th, and then it never reached him. Now, the second part of your question, I think, is one of the most important parts of the issue, because it goes to the idea that the security process on Capitol Hill is a couple hundred years old, very antiquated, and it just cannot keep pace with the events that we saw on January 6th. It's very territorial, if you will, sort of balkanized in terms of the security here in Washington. There are dozens of police forces, and especially when it comes to the Capitol, you have the Capitol Police, and then you have the sergeant at arms, who are responsible for physical security in the House and in the Senate. And when a decision is made to bring in the National Guard, you have to have a committee, basically. You have to bring all of these parties together to have agreement from a board. And I know that sounds very sort of bureaucratic and esoteric, and frankly it is. And that's one of the main sort of spanners that went into the works on January 6th. It was working through that process. It could not happen quickly, and they simply were flat-footed in terms of their security posture for the riots that then developed.
So as you know, Catherine, the Department of Justice said last week that domestic extremism is a serious and growing public safety threat. And the Judiciary Committee chair, that's Senator Dick Durbin, has said he is looking forward to hearing Wray's testimony on the subject. As I pointed out earlier with our Chris Van Cleve, Director Wray has often on the Hill explained to lawmakers that domestic terrorism, that white supremacy, that anti-Semitism remains a clear and present danger for the United States. It's one of the greatest threats we are facing as a nation. So I guess the question for me is, he's been upfront about that many, many times, so it's not new, and yet we're expecting that he's going to be grilled about what led to the January 6th insurrection. I guess my question is, is it your understanding that the lawmakers want to understand why we weren't better prepared to see some of these white supremacists and domestic terrorists at the Capitol, or because I'm just trying to understand. This is not like they're going to all of a sudden say to him, hey, we never knew that this was a problem in the United States. You never told us that. He's going to say, I've been raising the alarm for the last 3 years.
So I think you're getting to a really important point, Vlad, and sort of to cut through it. I think the question is, if the FBI has been warning about domestic violent extremism for the last couple of years, how was it that they missed all of these warning signs that groups were organizing to block the certification of the Electoral College and overrun the Capitol?
Exactly.
Because, yes, so when you look at the indictments in these cases, what you see, especially with this group called the Oath Keepers, this is a militia group that the FBI describes as a group that believes the government is systematically stripping them of their rights. When you look at those conspiracy cases, what you see are allegations that the planning began as early as the presidential election in November. So you're talking about a 2-month lead up to January 6th, and the question is, if the FBI is on top of this issue, why is it that they could miss so many warning signs that these groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, were organizing in order to foment violence on January 6th? And one of the things I anticipate the FBI director will say in his defense is that because many of these issues go to questions of freedom of speech, to a certain extent the FBI's hands can be tied unless they see evidence of potential criminal activity. It's not like disrupting an ISIS sympathizer or an al-Qaeda sympathizer inside the United States who's become radicalized, because it's actually much the same mechanism that you have with extremism on the left and also on the right. But when you have domestic extremism that goes to a political ideology, you get into these sticky questions of freedom of speech. And I expect that that's going to be an issue that's heavily litigated in the testimony today.
You know, earlier on CBSN AM, you know, we spoke to an expert in this area, and one of the things that he said was a challenge for the FBI is that while there are, I think it's 18 people so far that have been charged with conspiracy, the vast majority of those who overran the Capitol will probably find themselves with sort of trespassing or wrongful or what's it like? Yeah, essentially trespassing charges.
Unauthorized
sort of minor
access
charges
to a restricted area. Yeah.
You got it. That's exactly what it is, which is pretty minor. And part of the challenge is that when it comes to terrorism, there isn't sort of specific domestic terrorism charges that can be filed against these people. So I guess my question is, you know, it's certainly a focus of the FBI. It has been for, you know, a number of years. But is the FBI kind of challenged by the fact that the laws haven't caught up with the threat?
I think and this is just my own view, having covered this for 2 decades, I think when you start to focus on how you're going to prosecute these cases, you're missing the fundamental goal here, which is what people in law enforcement and intelligence call getting left of boom. So in other words, you want to get in front of the event so that you can disrupt it, right? You don't want to focus on how you're going to prosecute and track down people after the fact. And so when you're talking about these terrorism laws and how they might apply to the prosecution of these individuals, the larger question is, how are we going to take the surveillance tools that are already available to the FBI and the Justice Department, and how are we going to apply them to American citizens inside this country who we believe may be engaging in activity that is potentially criminal and also engaging in activity that is fomenting violence, as we saw on the Capitol?
Catherine Herridge, always here to provide clarity through your reporting and your sources. Thank you, Catherine, as always.
You're welcome.